more Europeans. So the extractive institutions were imposed by European colonial powers and were built in high mobility regions. And they have no long-term property rights implemented. And they were designed to extract resources for colonial powers.
So the main reason, the main difference between where the settler institutions and the extractive institutions were built was the mortality rates for the arriving Europeans. So in areas where the Europeans had a high mortality rate because of local diseases they didn't know, mostly in the core of the continent, they couldn't survive, so they rather used these regions to extract resources from them and settled on the coasts where they were less likely to catch a local disease. So on these so where the Europeans were able to build, where the Europeans were able to settle, they used their power to create institutions. So, because this is, we can compare this to British North America, where the arriving Brits were able to demand rights from the British state and build long-lasting property rights.
So in the areas with high mortality, the work and the settlement was mainly done by African slaves and indigenous populations. So the Europeans concentrated their settlement on, like Yazan said, on the areas with low mortality rate. And while these institutions that were developed did not theoretically, in the ideas of Edgemonu, Johnson and Robinson, hinder development during the colonial times, after the end of colonialism they started to prevent further development because they restricted modernization in this sense. But before that there was a potential, there was the possibility of development, but Latin American states did not seize that opportunity and forsake their possibilities of development in the long run.
Yeah, good. Very much summarized. Any other questions? If not,
And one of the most important arguments of the author was that there was this mercantilist economic approach, especially from Spain and Portugal, which colonized almost the entire Latin American countries. And this mercantilist approach to the economic policies was really protectionist. So it was really export-led. Didn't really focus on it was protectionist of the European countries, but not of the Latin American countries. So it led to the capital being exported all of the time. There was also contrast to the English methods, which were more liberal.
Yes, the more liberal British economy then allowed for local economical development. It permitted that the local structures be reinforced and be enriched, whereas, like you said, the Spanish approach took the resources away and prevented a local development of structures. A very important fact is also that the context was different, the geography, the cultures, the people living there were different, and so they had to deal with pre-existing power structures, for example, which made it a different context than for the British. So the political system couldn't be applied in the same way and led to different results.
Mercantilism is more or less also a closed market because the Latin American countries and trades were mainly also with Spain and Portugal, as the two European countries, but were limited, and more or less the benefit of international trade was not really utilized. And we had the impression also that there was a lot of confusion about what are causes, effects, and what is really more or less the constraints, and the constraints are more or less from land, culture, and pre-existing structures, and that they have not really utilized these structures appropriately.
And also from a purely economical standpoint, they were really being unproductive. And so, despite the capital not being there, they didn't really make use of all the resources they had. And that was one of the main arguments why Latin America behind so far, due to this, according to this.
I wouldn't say maybe not productive, but very productive, but all of this production will just go to the crown, no? To the main Iberian economies. Because of this mercantilism is like the economic side of absolutism, no? So these absolutist kings and queens in this time, they were the autocrats, they dictated everything that happened. They even got power even above the church and the law, so they were above the law. And so all of these extractions were for themselves. They even didn't allow the colonies to trade within themselves. So this restricted it was, so of course we cannot have a lot of development within this framework.
And the only benefit was more or less to increase the wealth of
Yeah, it's just accumulate gold, and this is a mercantilist idea. I accumulate whatever resources I have, and I become a better power than Britain, for example.
I think you can make the argument that in theory the countries were productive, yes, the Latin American countries, but not themselves, right?
Yeah,
And that's why
not
they started being productive.
exactly. Sometimes not even the Europeans that were already settled there were able to get these riches because they had to really send them out to the crowd.
So maybe we had phrased it wrong, but like it was the point that we were trying to do with the little to no trade between the other empires and the fact that the export of the resources were then always towards the crown and never used in the place of production to strengthen.
Yeah,
the
exactly. So
that's what we meant with the.
yeah, I got this. Yeah, I got it correctly. Yeah. Thank you, guys.
It was more or less a kind of source only to export raw material to the European countries. It's like a mine.
Exactly, just a piece of land with the products, and sometimes even like manufacturing was not allowed because then this was reserved to make the crown and the countries in the European peninsula to become richer with this manufacturing. So this is the main. Okay, then let's go to the last. So what was the conclusion by this this?
So we should decide, or we should answer the question if he agrees with the arguments you now told us. We have to say that he refuses kind of all of them a bit, and blaming the institution, the Spanish and Portuguese institution. For Engerman, he says one argument against it is that during colonial area, North and Latin America were not that different in economic growth or inequality. And one example is is Cuba, that we had there high economic growth, but at the same time high inequality. I think in Brazil was the opposite, so you can't argue with that.
Exactly why?
Yeah, because if we see inequality, and at the same time economic growth, this.
Yeah. So thinking about these variables, no? At the end you have a model, you have some variables, so you're trying to determine growth or why the Latin American countries did not grow, and then you have all of these different stories in each country, so you don't have a strong foundation.
let's move on to the second part. I was not familiar with the pronunciation of the name, so I just called them AJR.
That's fine.
Catsworth is agreeing with the argument, especially about the extractive institutions, that these matter for the long-term development of the country, but he does not agree with the time period, and he says kind of that they choose the wrong period, that the problem was not during the colonial institution time, but more after the liberalization, and I just wrote on the after the independence, right? That the problem was more after this time, because then institution could come up and more like a elite part of the social variety. That was the main problem for him after that.
Which elites at the end?
Coming up elites in the economic role, like I'm not sure.
After independence.
Right.
So the elites were the ones who.
Yeah, they were coming up, and that was the main problem for him after that, after the independence.
Yeah, so the last part, I also don't know how to pronounce it right, so it's lang, whatever.
LMH.
Yeah. He shifts the focus more on, or is shifting the focus away from internal inequality towards the type of empire who ruled the colonies. And he said, for example, the British colonialism was more liberal and market oriented, while the Spanish colonialism was more state driven and driven by control. In the long run, there's different approaches from the British and the Spanish leads to different development paths, and and that's the closest to his argument, because he said that Latin America did not fall behind mainly because of colonial inequality, and that's basically his main argument. And the problem was that they couldn't manage to modernize the institutions, especially during the colonialism, but also after the colonialism, during civil wars and arguments in the population. They didn't manage to modernize the state, and that was that caused the bad base for economic growth.
One important argument also with this was that he said, actually, especially with the LMH argument, is that, okay, so the LMH are saying it was because the way that the mercantilism versus the liberal economy, but he said actually none of these powers were that strong, they were weak. So how can you say that they were the ones who caused this path dependence or this lack of development? So this is his counter-argument, that they were weak in some sense. And so I think
I didn't understand correctly at that point. They were weak because they couldn't manage to modernize the institution, because then during industrialization they can develop economic growth. Or he said they're just weak because they couldn't control the state.
So he said the Iberian powers were weak during the colonization, so they were not that strong to change the base of the society that much as people say. That's his counter argument.
Okay.
And but then also another argument which was related to the against the Asimov one is that also after colonization, these governments that were made, these post-independent governments, they were also very weak, but because of the wars. So you have this destroyment of
Because they were already affected.
Yeah, exactly. And also this makes you ask yourself, okay, if everything changed after independence, why do we still say that colonialism still prevails today? No, so this history still seems to say. That's what he's trying to say. But he says still at the end, his conclusion is that yes, colonialism was important, but not in the way that these authors are saying. He's saying that also the post-independence elites, they try to manage the states as if they were like the Iberian powers. And so these
leave the majority out of it, for example, in political
to
power.
leave the majority, yeah, because they were elites. So they just try to maybe have these extractive institutions by themselves.
Yes.
And so these also failed. Yeah.
I think that argument is really interesting because at my in anthropology there's always this decolonial perspective and to hear this argument that maybe it wasn't really that much colonialism that affected the economy nowadays. For me, I think, yeah, okay, that makes more sense to me. Maybe, I don't know if it's so useful to look back at history, like, I think it's really useful to look back at history, and of course colonialism had, I think, really big effects on not only the economy, but also the society. But when you look at it now, I think it's kind of like pretty far-fetched, you know, and especially, I mean, after the liberalization, I mean, you saw economic growth in Latin American countries, and some countries were really rich, and I think maybe the focus has to be more on the liberalization and like the independence of the countries. Maybe, I don't know. I also wanted to ask what you think about that argument.
No, yes, I think it's what we are debating, what we are seeing during the class. First of all, thank you guys. So just one final word, because we don't have time now so we need time for the presentation. At the beginning, we saw everything that happened during the 1900s, even a bit of the 1800s, post-independence. So a lot of things have happened. Of course, things have changed. But then this is where you have the theories here, no? So these are theories, and the author also is a historian, so he also has theories. But then how do we test these? Because they can be contradictory sometimes. Some say no, it is the colonial period that still permeates today, and some people say no. So then now we need to go into practice and test these theories with empirical methods. So, and for this, we have these papers that we will see now with the presentation. There's also a very good one in the further readings, which is about these names in Colombia that kind of hint towards the conclusion that yes, still colonialism is there today. So it's very, as in economics, at the end you always say it depends. Which variables you use, which perspectives you have, it's very difficult to reach one conclusion in this topic. So then let's have the presentation because we don't have many comments, and then we continue. Does anyone have a computer that the HTML, yeah, unfortunately, there's no adapter.
Do you need an adapter? I have
on the long-run legacy of colonialism. We'll start with a little overview of what we're going to talk about today. First of all, we're going to introduce to you the authors of this paper. We'll do a little CRAP test. We'll present to you the research questions, the motivations of this paper, why it is important, the hypothesis, then the methodology, how the paper worked and related. We'll do an interpretation of the findings, expressing the extensions of the paper, do a connection from our paper to the mandatory reading, present our criticism, and end with a summary and the main takeaways of the presentation. There were two authors on this paper, Luis Angeles, who is a professor of economics at the University of Glasgow, and a researcher in the field of economic history, inequality, and economic development. The other author is Aldo Rizalde, who's a lecturer in economics at Queen's Business School, and a researcher in the field of economic history and development. That's the CRAP test that we did. We would say it's current. It was written in 2015 and revised in 2016 and published finally in 2017, which is pretty recent in our opinion for a paper on long-run development. It is relevant because it's for researchers and students of development economics. Obviously it's an advanced paper. Yes. The authority of this paper is instituted by the authors, who are both researchers at the University of Glasgow, and by the publisher, Elsevier, who's a top-tier peer-reviewed academic journal. It's accurate. We believe the datasets are established since they have been written 50 years ago and been cited many, many times. It's been peer-revised and includes many robustness checks. The purpose of this paper is to explain the long-run roots of economic development. Now, this will be our question that will lead our presentation. What are the effects of pre-colonial institutions on present-day socio-economic outcomes in Latin America?
So why do we even ask ourselves this question? So we're a course on developmental economics, and what this paper does is doing a step in explaining the developmental differences in Latin America, by also filling a literature gap, since most studies on the development of Latin America and the developmental differences only look at the colonial times and have a heavy focus on institutions implemented during colonial times, but ignoring the institutions existing before colonial times, since I think maybe that's too far away or not relevant anymore. And also, one thing the authors analyze is the impact of the Republic of the Indians, which is well researched in societal fields like sociology, but the economic impact is barely researched, so that's also an important part of this paper. And what we do by looking at pre-colonial institutions is also moving away from Eurocentristic approaches.
This is a hypothesis, structured in 4 parts. First of all, the institutional survival. It assumes that the institutions that were before the colonial powers endured and kept a capacity of institutional strength throughout these centuries of colonial dominance, and led to a power on political advocacy, especially in the last 100, 200 years, that enabled the Amerindians to defend themselves. And finally, to nowadays, it led to developmental outcomes that are heavily influenced by this pre-colonial infrastructures.
Yeah, so what they do is try to describe a mechanism of how the pre-colonial institutions could have impacted to their outcomes by looking at how these Amerindians, the indigenous people, could use formal power to secure their social status in the new existing national states forming in the 19th and 20th century. And then we look at the methodology. So how did the authors conduct the story? The first step, what they did is taking South America, Latin America apart. They looked at 17 countries of Latin America, the mainland countries, and they looked at the biggest sub-administrative unit, so the biggest unit above the national states, and structures in Latin America in these units. And what they, the other big pillar of this study is Merle's Ethnographic Atlas, which is a pre-colonial complexity index, which was formulated in the 60s and 70s, and Merle tried to describe how far these different parts of the world and also South America were developed before the colonialists arrived. So that's a very important data set for such kind of studies. And this index is structured from 0 to 4. You can see here the highest regions is cultures we already know, like the Aztecs and the Incas. And on the coast we can see a very low degree of pre-colonial institutional complexity. So how did the authors use these data sets? First, they had to take modern census data of these subnational units to find out how many, or to take the distribution of Amerindians living in these different subnational units and looking at the ethnic composition, and they matched these data together to take 102 different Amerindian groups and to the different subnational units, and with the degree of complexity of these units, they were able to form one final variable, which is called the pre-colonial institutions. And the pre-colonial institutions is our main predictor, which we are looking at in our econometric model, which is used to predict socioeconomic outcomes. And if this indicator seems to have a positive impact across controls, robustness checks, then the author's hypothesis can be undermined. So we did the authors did extensive controls for geography, natural resources, colonial era activities, which would be the main critique points if you don't do that, but they also conducted extensive robustness checks.
So let's pass on to the interpretation of the findings. This is one of the first tables. The authors wanted to see what is the effect of the coefficient of pre-colonial institutions on the percentage of population having completed secondary education today. As we can see, there is a strong effect. It's statistically significant to the 5% level and has up to 3 or 4%, an effect of 3 or 4%. In the second column, we can see that there was a second regressor added, which is the share of Amerindian population. This increased greatly the recessor of pre-colonial institutions, and shows how today the Amerindians still suffer greatly because of historical reasons, but also because of racism, for example. The Amerindians with the better pre-colonial roots are doing better, though, as we can see here. Then the question was, maybe this big effect of the coefficient of pre-colonial institution is only there because of geographical reasons. Maybe the people that are doing well are not doing well because of their pre-colonial institutions, but because of the pre-colonial institutions were located in places that have natural resources or other gifts, like being close to the sea or to rivers. Therefore, they added multiple other recessors to see if this coefficient would then fade out. As we can see, this didn't happen. The coefficient maintained a level of almost 8% throughout all added controls, which include temperature, the altitude, the ruggedness index, which is like how good the Earth is, if they're landlocked, the distance to the capital, etc. The last column, that included all controls, was then used to check the effect of pre-colonial institutions of 8 different dependent variables.
are all like show another part of societies in Latin America nowadays. And we can see pre-colonial institutions have a huge effect on all of these 8 variables. They're always statistically significant either to the 1% level or the 5% level, which is very important. They always have a good effect in the sense of infant mortality is decreased, years of schooling, primary education, secondary education, access to drinking water or to electricity is improved, and most especially the economic variables are those that have the greatest effect. Almost 20% on the GDP per capita and minus more than 10% on the poverty rates. This is a lot. If you take in account a change of, like if you take in account 2 places that are identical in all that aspects, but one has a pre-colonial institutional coefficient of 1, and the other one has pre-colonial institutional coefficient of 3, this will increase the GDP per capita by 38%. That's a lot. Now, to the table of 7. Here the question was, what if we had more controls? Maybe the pre-colonial institutions did so well only because they were rich when the colonizer came. They did so by adding coefficients for pre-colonial population density, which is a proxy to the wealth of the region. Or maybe it was the activities that were put in place by the colonizers that led to this great development throughout the centuries. As we can see, all these regressors didn't affect the variable for pre-colonial institutions, who maintained the level of almost 7% and stayed statistically significant. The other variables added were about how the population was working, like where were they employed in. And this still didn't affect the pre-colonial institution. So more regressors were added, like maybe slavery has had an effect, or democratic, initial democratical patterns, like the fact that there were elections or property rights. But nothing had an effect. Finally, the coefficient of pre-colonial institution maintained its importance throughout all these added regressors. It's actually very interesting to see that even even elections and property rights seem to have not a positive effect on today's development situation, which is surprising. I would believe that if someone had democratic institutions back in the day, they would be better off, right? But as we can see, that's not the case. You cannot see it right now here, but they also did like a test of correlation between elections and pre-colonial institutions and property rights and pre-colonial institutions. Like if they did elections before the colons came, or if they were property rights before the colonizer came. And there is no correlation, which is very surprising. Let's now pass on to the examples.
Yeah, so the authors also extended on that question and looked at the effect of how the effect of the pre-colonial institutions differed from rural to urban areas. So we can see our variable pre-colonial institutions, and we can see the impact on rural areas and primary education is far bigger than in urban areas. Here we have the same effect basically in every column. So we can see that the degree of complexity the Amerindians had in their pre-colonial institutions had a bigger impact on nowadays life for the Amerindians than in urban areas, which is not so surprising because in urban areas the authors assume that the institutions implemented by the national states were better able to suppress Amerindian power. And the other extension they looked at is whether Amerindians and non-Amerindians had a different degree of profiteering from this, because not only the Amerindians profited from their pre-colonial institutions, but also the can see like the effects are pretty similar between the Amerindians and the non-Amerindians in both columns, which will extend our hypothesis by saying the externalities by improving the Amerindians' life also improve the non-Amerindians' lives and the economy as a total. And then we also looked at how our paper could maybe synergize with the mandatory reading we had today from Colesworth. And one big argument Colesworth made is that the elites clenching onto the power is a negative for development, while our authors, Angeles and Elizalde, made the argument that Amerindians challenging the elites, challenging the society with their higher degree of political complexity, pre-colonial institutions, is a positive. So we can see Colesworth describing a top-down dimension and Angeles describing a bottom-up dimension, which first seem contradictory, but maybe it's just the same struggle from two sides, which would bring us to the conclusion that political equality, no matter if it's from elites getting out of power or from a lower status group like the Amerindians fighting for the power, is a positive. So not only political and not only economic inequality is a negative for development, but also political inequality. And then what are the criticisms of this paper? So one criticism is that they had to use modern census data to describe the population distribution of Amerindians, which is difficult since we want to describe the pre-colonial institutions, which are multiple 100 years ago. So one big argument, one big criticism against that would be migration, because we don't know how, they don't look at how the people maybe migrated somewhere else, which makes it difficult to have an accurate result. And also the authors, while matching the Amerindians to the subnational units, they were only able to match 71% of the Amerindians, which leaves almost 30% of our subject group not matched, which also is a limitation of our results. And they had to rely on the Murdoch Ethnographic Atlas, which is a reliable data set, but still a limitation since Murdoch tried to map pre-colonial institutions a few hundred years after them existing. So that's also a limitation. Note the summary.
These are the main 3 points that we looked at today. So if you have something to take away, these are the things. The effect of pre-colonial institutions is largely underrated by researchers and the academic society. The authors did an important step in filling this research gap. Socioeconomic development outcomes were not only determined by nice climate, good gold mines, or easy access to the sea, but also by the pre-colonial organizational capacity. And finally, this text and Colesworth highlighted the importance of the political dimension. Thank you so much for your attention, and if you have some questions,
Thank you guys. I think we have 2 comments today, so let's just start with them. So Samuel and Rico, whoever wants to, you were first.
Yes, yes, I think the presentation was really good. It was very well introduced, and it was like well structured, and especially in the introduction, you had a good detailed separation of the hypothesis, of the findings, of like the argumentative steps that were employed in the paper, which made it easy to follow. And I think it was also well employed at which point you used data as it was used in the paper on your presentation. And I think especially regarding how you spoke, I found it really freely spoken, very well presented. You only had like the small Karteikarten, I don't know how to say this in English, but you used them barely. You spoke very, like you spoke very freely. I think that was very good. I found it sometimes, even though it was well employed, I still found it hard to follow the metrics sometimes. I found it hard to follow the numbers and the logic behind them. And I think this has nothing to do with like your presentation necessarily, but I find the thesis kind of implausible. Because like if you look at like the main thesis is like that strong pre-colonial institutions had a positive effect on like socioeconomic development. But I think if we look at like Latin America, it's like places like Bolivia, Peru, South Mexico, which are the poorest areas now in Latin America, which had also these strong pre-colonial institutions. So I don't know what metrics they used in order to justify their claims, but I find it implausible. But this has nothing to do with your presentation, like it's a paper instead. And yes.
Thank you so much.
Yes, I really can agree with you for like how well it was, because it's very high in econometric methodology, and I think it's very hard to like explain this in few and easy words, and I think you did it very well, and you covered all the mandatory things you should include, like the crab test you did in the beginning. It was very nice, the motivation you made very clear, and at the end you connected it with the mandatory reading you did. That was very nice too. Yes, so all the tables you presented were explained, so that's also very nice. Your design of your slides were very minimalistic. This was also perfect. Just one thing about the yellow, I don't know if it's the projector, but that's just one like point I would say you could improve, but yes, very well. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Anybody wants to comment?
So I would answer to one
Yes,
point
please.
made, about the plausibility, because we had the same intuition, thinking, okay, the countries where the Aztecs were included are not particularly well off now. You said South Mexico, but while we still support this thesis is the consistency, like Thomas showed all the tables, like no matter which controls we use, which other variables we use, it was a very consistent effect. And our explanation for that is that just other factors influencing development, and wherever Indians lived, they were already very badly off, but what the pre-colonial institutions made it a bit better for them. So even though the intuition is not really supporting this thesis, the data is so consistent that we still deliver it.
Yes. So basically we're saying like they're doing bad, they're doing a bit better thanks to the performance institutions. Like they have a positive effect on people.
And maybe also the fact that he used an administrative level that was different. So you mentioned countries in general. So maybe a good thing that the author could have done is like also show at the country level. But of course, countries as we have today, they have changed along the time. No? So you have the Mayan Empire, the Inca Empire spanning many different countries. So this is also hard to match together with the countries that you have today. So maybe this could explain why you see these discrepancies. But yeah, it's hard to do everything in one paper. So, but this is a very good observation that maybe could be explored further with this data as well. Okay, maybe I have some comments. So yeah, in general, very nice presentation. It looks like you prepared a lot and you did your research to present this paper in a very simple way and that is understandable for everyone. In timing also very, very nice, organized. So I'm not gonna repeat what everyone said, but maybe yeah. So the most important part for me was the index. So explaining these political institutions, I think you did it nicely, but maybe you can do it now. to explain exactly what it means, this 0 to 4, because it's a bit abstract, so that people really understand, okay, how they really calculate this for in this time where you didn't have GDP measures or maybe even population measures. So what did they do exactly? Do you remember? 0 to 4.
Yes, so basically they gave a value to all type of structures that could be, like the Incas were like the thing before, and maybe like little gangs in the one. And they took these areas and took an average of the societies that populated these areas, and this average gave the index for that place.
Yeah, exactly. So you have, but more specifically, you have this like, so 0 was this like just
like there are
bands.
Yeah, there were
people.
even families just
Yeah.
living
So
by
they are
themselves.
not. So these are people that are not organized, and whenever you think civilization, maybe it's a wrong word, but whenever you think about these states today, they have this defense. No? So these, let's say, if you have a band of people that live alone, probably they cannot defend themselves in front of the settlers who come and take their land or whatever.
And also, I think the identity is really important. Like, if you had a high complexity, it means that it was a structure of multiple cities interconnected and working with each other with like a centralized type of government,
Exactly.
which led to also an identity for the population that survived the century. Like, if there was a little group of people in the jungle 500 years ago, they have a very small chance to have like something connecting them over 500 years. On the other hand, if you were part of the Incas, you have a more connected structure.
And especially this ability to defend themselves, no? Which was what you showed in this very nice chart on the hypothesis, no? How, and at the same time, it's like the mechanism. So it's a very far-fetched idea and thesis. Okay, yeah, even pre-colonial institutions, or we were debating, do colonial institutions still matter today? And they are asking, do pre-colonial institutions still matter today? It's even farther away. And then they're trying to show all these things. And one of the mechanisms is looking at these specific groups. Okay, it's not maybe everybody, but these specific Amerindians who had like their own nation, they could really organize themselves and defend themselves. And this is a variable that shows that today this matters still today. Even adding all of these other controls. So they added what everybody said here. They added other
every
colonial
possible thing.
variables. Yeah. Yeah, and you showed, I think, the criticism as well as valid. And their relationship with the mandatory reading also, I think, was very, very nice. They showed this top-down, bottom-up relationship. I think I didn't see that, so that was very, very important to show. Maybe one last thing was about their robustness test, because I think they showed in some robustness checks some of the criticisms that you put in there. So maybe you could have mentioned this briefly, but of course not everything has to be shown this way. Yes, I think in the style everything was fine. The yellow I like, but
It looks better on my computer.
Yeah, this is the problem. It's exactly this. So always think about the beamers. This one is old, especially, so it doesn't show the nice things as nice as you think. But it's fine. I think at least we can read everything, and that is important. I would say maybe just one recommendation is, I mean, you already did everything that I like, that you are not reading the notes all the time, you're talking by yourself. It shows me that you are prepared in practice. But also to practice for the future, your tone, how you look at people, that they engage, maybe also do some question in the middle so people are engaged, thinking in what you are doing. But just a small thing. So otherwise, it's very, very complete. Did anybody else have a comment or question in general regarding this topic? And are you maybe, since you had this question about the colonial parts, what do you think about these pre-colonial institutions?
I think it's too far-fetched.
You don't buy it?
Yeah, I don't buy it, no.
Okay.
I think it's important to have a look at history, but I think it's also important not to get focused too much on things that are too far behind. But I mean, I also have to say they really pay much attention. But I really like the yellow of the presentation actually. I think it's really good with the contrast. I never saw that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that
Oh,
was
different
better.
stuff.
Okay, but I mean, what I want you to notice is that you may have theories and you may have sometimes questions like this that could be far-fetched. And when you have access to this data, you can try to at least show some evidence. It's not conclusive, it's never the final solution, but it shows you some evidence that there are still some threats that matter for it to be.
And I would be interested because these counter-arguments are really valid from my perspective. What is the overall conclusion in research on this matter about pre-colonial consequences still for today?
It's still an open question. This is the interesting part.
Yeah, we also said it's like a literature gap, so this is one of the first papers even asking this question.
Yeah,
so I think
exactly.
there still can be a lot of research done. And we also have limitations, so we may never find out because we mentioned limitations like migration, water atlas, so it's difficult.
Yeah, exactly. But as you see, you can still write a paper on this and ignite a conversation and have that dialogue on whether these things matter or not. So I think it's still valid to show it and that you know what these theories are about.
I have one question. Now there was like subnational and they compared different districts or whatever. Are there more global papers on that? For example, now we focus on Latin America, or what is with New Zealand, Australia, etc. Because the countries in general better well off than Latin America. So that's not a question to you, but just in general, is there some evidence?
You have the answer.
Yeah, no, actually, I thought I would, but I don't actually because I don't have it on Australia or New Zealand. But there is exactly a very similar paper to this on Africa, still using Murdoch's ethnic atlas. And since it's an atlas, there might be also Australia and New Zealand.
Maybe, I don't know, maybe you can take a look at this data and look
You
for
can fill the
Australia. Okay, thank you
Talk about the presentation. How to shoot the presentation.
We should say appointments. We should say appointment about presentation, and we can discuss the details. And you can send me the emails in the web mail. And,
So just